HOA buried my culvert. So I waited as their tennis courts cracked into rubble. What happens when an HOA buries someone else's culvert? And how could that decision possibly end with their own tennis courts cracking into rubble? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I am glad you are here for another unforgettable neighborhood justice story. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Thank you for watching, supporting the channel, and continuing to spend your time with us. Your support truly means a lot. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Let's begin the story. That pipe is not decoration, Susan. The skid steer kept backing toward my lane anyway, its warning alarm cutting through the cold Virginia morning while the steel bucket scraped a load of red clay across the gravel. It was 6:40, barely light outside Roanoke, and I could smell diesel exhaust, wet dirt, and crushed stone before I reached the lower bend of my property. Todd Brennan was behind the controls. Susan Harwood stood beside the drainage ditch holding a rolled landscaping plan under one arm and a paper coffee cup in the other. 3 feet of my culvert outlet had already disappeared beneath fresh fill. I stopped at the edge of the work area and stared at the mound. The culvert was 36-inch reinforced concrete, old but solid, running beneath the private farm lane my family had used for decades. Yesterday, its concrete head wall had been completely visible. That morning, only the upper curve remained. Todd lowered another bucket of soil. "Stop right there," I called. He glanced toward Susan before lifting his hands away from the controls. Susan gave me the polished smile she used whenever she wanted a disagreement to sound like a scheduling issue. "Good morning, Ryan. It looks better already." I walked closer. A thin stream of muddy water was pushing through the fresh soil where the outlet should have been open. Better is not the word I would use. She looked at the pipe. The board approved improvements to the drainage corridor. That exposed concrete has been an eyesore for years. "So you buried it?" "We softened it." I crouched near the edge without touching anything. Water had already started pooling against the fill. Not much. Maybe an inch above where I normally saw it after a dry week. But water does not need much time to explain a mistake. "This is the outlet," I said. "It needs somewhere to discharge." Susan unrolled the plan. It showed decorative stone, topsoil, sod, and a landscaped slope. No drainage detail. No pipe section. No elevation marks. The water can still move through the soil. I looked at her. That is not how a 36-inch culvert works. Her smile disappeared. "My name is Ryan Keller. I was 50 years old, and I had spent nearly 3 decades building driveways, excavating building pads, correcting failed drainage, replacing culverts, and fixing sites where somebody thought dirt could negotiate with gravity. I own 19 acres below Fox Hollow Estates. Their neighborhood sat uphill from me. All trimmed entrances, stone signs, clubhouse landscaping, and 2 tennis courts behind a black chain-link fence. Years earlier, the subdivision developer had been granted a recorded drainage easement across part of my property so runoff from the common areas could continue downstream. That agreement allowed water to cross. It did not turn my land into their construction site. Susan tapped the plan with one manicured finger. "The Homeowners Association maintains this drainage area. Maintains access to drainage. That is different from burying my structure." Todd climbed down from the skid steer. "Ryan, I told them I wanted to check the pipe elevation first." Susan turned toward him. "And I told you the board approved the landscaping." I pulled out my phone. I photographed the buried head wall, the fresh tire tracks, the fill, the muddy water, and Susan's plan. Then I stepped toward the oak beside the lane and photographed the red elevation nail driven into its trunk years ago. A few feet away, a brass survey cap sat flush with the ground near the ditch. I photographed that too. Susan watched me. "Are you documenting landscaping now?" "I document drainage before somebody changes it." She folded the plan. "There is nothing dangerous happening here." I did not say there was. I stood and looked uphill. Beyond the trees, I could see the upper fence line around Fox Hollow's tennis courts catching the first gray light. Susan followed my eyes, but did not ask why. I looked back at the thin stream struggling through the dirt where open air had been the day before. She thought she had hidden an ugly pipe. I was more interested in where all that water would go now that she had. By 7:30, Todd had shut down the skid steer and Susan had left in her sport utility vehicle, but the fresh mound of red clay was still pressed against the culvert like a hand over a mouth. I did not touch it. I walked the lane instead. 30 years in excavation and drainage had taught me that water rarely announces a problem at the place where somebody caused it. It shows up where the grade gets flatter, where the soil holds moisture longer, where a base course loses support, where a ditch stops carrying what it used to carry. Most people notice the crack. I noticed what happened before the crack. The first thing I checked was the brass survey cap beside the ditch. It sat exactly where it always had, level with the ground near the edge of my 19 acres. I cleaned mud off the top with my glove and took another photograph. Then I moved to the red elevation nail in the oak. That nail had been driven years ago when I replaced part of the lane shoulder and wanted a permanent reference point. I kept a folding level rod in my truck, so I pulled it out and checked the relative elevation between the nail, the top of the culvert, and the water now backing against the fill. The difference was small, but the direction was wrong. Water that should have had open discharge was starting to stack upstream. I walked down to the head wall. A white mineral stain curved across the concrete about 4 inches below the current water surface. That line had been there for years, left by normal seasonal flow after heavier storms. I ran one finger along it, then looked at the muddy water above it. Susan had buried the last 3 feet of outlet less than 2 hours earlier, and the water was already higher than the old mark. Near the upper corner of the head wall was a rusted bolt from an old mounting bracket my father had never removed. I photographed it with the water line in the same frame. Fixed objects matter. They give arguments something solid to stand on. Then I drove uphill toward Fox Hollow Estates. I did not enter any restricted area. I stayed on the public side of the common lane and parked near the recreation complex where I had been invited for maintenance work years earlier. The tennis court sat behind black fencing, 2 full courts laid side by side on a raised pad. The asphalt looked clean from a distance. Green playing surface, white lines, low retaining edge along one side. Nothing looked wrong. That was why I kept walking. Beside court 2, near the fence corner, sat a small rectangular inspection grate set into the ground. I remembered it because I had seen the original site work crew install it when Fox Hollow was still being built. At the time, I assumed it was part of the court perimeter drainage. I crouched near the fence, close enough to see without crossing anything, and took a photograph. Water sat just below the grate opening, higher than I remembered. I could not prove where it ran from there without drawings, and I was not interested in guessing. I drove home and pulled an old storage box from the shelf in my workshop. Inside were survey copies, repair invoices, hand sketches, and notes my father had kept on the culvert. One faded page listed the pipe size, outlet elevation, and the year the concrete section had been replaced. 36 inches. Reinforced concrete. Gravity discharge. No pumps. No valves. Nothing complicated. That was the point. A culvert works because the outlet is lower than the water entering it, and because the exit stays open enough for flow to leave. You can decorate around that fact, but you cannot negotiate with it. Around noon, Todd called me. His voice was quieter than it had been that morning. "Ryan, I wanted you to know I told Susan we should have somebody check the drainage detail." "What did she say?" He hesitated. "She said it was just a ditch." I looked through the workshop window toward the lower lane. Water was still dark against the new fill. For words, it was just a ditch. I had heard expensive mistakes described with fewer, but not many. Susan called it beautification. That was the word printed across the top of the landscape proposal she had carried under her arm that morning, as if changing the name of the work changed what the dirt was doing. Fox Hollow Estates had spent years polishing its image. Stone entrance walls, matching mailbox posts, trimmed ornamental grasses around the clubhouse, fresh paint on the tennis pavilion every spring. The courts were one of Susan's favorite selling points whenever new owners toured the neighborhood. She liked photographs taken late in the afternoon when the green surface looked smooth, the white lines looked sharp, and the fencing disappeared against the trees. What she did not like was anything downhill that looked unfinished. My culvert head wall qualified. Exposed concrete, open swale, rust stain, gravel shoulder. To me, those were working parts. To Susan, they were flaws in the view. 2 days after Todd called me, I saw the full beautification plan in an electronic mail she sent to the board and copied to me. Decorative stone around the ditch, topsoil over the lower edge, sod down to the drainage corridor, shrubs placed far enough apart to look natural but close enough to hide the concrete. The drawing was pretty. It was also missing the one thing that mattered. There was no drainage section. No outlet profile. No invert elevation. No engineer's stamp. I called Todd. Did you design this? No, who did? Susan marked what she wanted. I priced the labor and material. Did you tell her the outlet needed to stay open? He was quiet for a second. Twice. What exactly did she say? Todd sighed. She said, "It is a ditch, Todd." There it was again. 4 words. The most expensive sentence in Fox Hollow that year was 4 words long. I printed the landscape plan and laid it beside the old Culvert notes from my father. One document cared about appearance. The other cared about elevation. Only one of them could control where the water went. That afternoon, I drove the lane after a light rain. The fill around the culvert had settled enough to show dark, wet streaks through the red clay. Water was finding tiny paths, but none of them equaled an open 36-inch outlet. I photographed the white mineral line on the concrete again. The new water surface sat higher. I checked the red elevation nail. Same reference. Same result. Then I drove uphill and stopped near the recreation complex. A youth tennis clinic was ending, and parents were gathering along the fence while players collected balls. The court still looked perfect. Bright surface. Straight lines. Dry enough to play on. Susan stood near the pavilion talking with 2 residents, smiling as if the whole neighborhood had been freshly staged for a brochure. I stayed in my truck. I was not interested in making a scene over something I could measure. Before leaving, I looked toward the inspection grate beside Court 2. Water was still visible below it. Not overflowing. Not dramatic. Just high. On the drive home, I kept thinking about that grate and the buried outlet downhill. I did not yet know whether they were directly connected. Guessing would have made me no better than Susan. So I called Rebecca Sloan, the property attorney who had handled an access dispute for me years earlier. "I need the recorded drainage easement for Fox Hollow," I told her. "And if you can find them, the original site plans." "What changed?" she asked. I looked through the windshield at the fresh dirt covering the culvert. They improved something that was already working. Rebecca was silent for half a beat. "Send me photographs before anybody touches anything else." I smiled without meaning to. Already done. Susan thought the ugly part was the concrete she could see. I was starting to wonder whether the expensive part was hidden under the tennis courts she liked showing everyone. The letter arrived before Rebecca found the original engineering plans. Certified mail. Fox Hollow Estates letterhead. Susan's signature at the bottom. I opened it at my kitchen counter while rain ticked against the window and read the first sentence twice. I was directed not to interfere with association-installed drainage improvements located within the recorded easement corridor. The next paragraph warned that any removal of fill, stone, sod, or other materials placed by the Homeowners Association could result in fines, legal action, and recovery of restoration costs. I called Rebecca immediately. They put it in writing. "Read it exactly." I did. She was quiet for a moment. "Did they acknowledge the culvert?" "They call it a drainage feature." "Did they authorize you to expose the outlet?" "No. The opposite." "Then do not touch it." I looked through the window toward the lower lane. "I can clear that fill with my excavator in 20 minutes. And spend the next 2 years explaining why you ignored a written order while they claim you caused whatever happens next." I hated how reasonable that sounded. "So I just leave it. You document it. You warn them once more. You preserve every photograph, every water elevation, every communication, and every weather event. Then we find out what that easement actually says." The next morning I sent Susan a formal response. No insults. No threats. Just facts. The culvert outlet had been opened before the landscaping work. The new fill restricted discharge. Water levels had risen above the long-established white mineral line on the head wall. I recommended immediate restoration of the outlet by a qualified drainage contractor or civil engineer. Susan replied 4 hours later. "The board considers the matter closed. Please do not alter association improvements." I printed that sentence and placed it beside the certified letter. Then I started a log. Date. Rainfall. Water level relative to the red elevation nail. Condition of the head wall. Condition of the inspection grate near Court 2. I drove the property every morning before work and every evening when rain moved through. 3 days later, a steady storm dropped more than an inch across the area. The culvert did not stop flowing completely, but the discharge was reduced to a muddy seep through packed soil and decorative stone. Upstream, the water climbed higher. The old white line disappeared beneath it. I photographed the rusted bolt on the head wall with the water surface behind it, so there would be no argument about scale. Then I drove uphill. Fox Hollow's streets were shining black from the rain. Water ran along curbs toward the recreation complex. The tennis courts were empty, their green surface dark under the clouds. Beside Court 2, the inspection grate held water almost flush with the lower edge of the opening. I took a photograph from the common access area and left. 2 days later, Susan sent another message accusing me of creating unnecessary concern among residents by photographing association property. Rebecca answered that one for me. She wrote that I was documenting visible drainage conditions relevant to an active property dispute and would continue doing so from lawful locations. Susan did not reply. By the end of the week, Rebecca had located the recorded plat and ordered archived engineering sheets from the county records office. Mark Ellis, the surveyor, agreed to verify the easement corridor and the culvert position the following Monday. Until then, there was nothing for me to do except what Susan had ordered. I did not dig. I did not move one rock. I did not disturb one shovel of fill. Every time I passed the culvert, I could see exactly how quickly I could fix it. That was the hardest part. But the certified letter sat in my file with Susan's signature under a sentence telling me not to interfere. If water was going to make an argument now, I was going to let it speak in measurements. Mark Ellis arrived at 8 on Monday morning with a tripod, a survey rod, and the kind of expression that meant he had already decided not to trust anybody's memory. The air was cold enough to see our breath, and the ground beside the lane was still soft from the weekend rain. He found the brass survey cap in less than 10 minutes, checked it against the recorded plat, then walked the easement corridor with me while his instrument clicked quietly from point to point. "Culvert is on your property," he said. "Entire outlet." "Yes." He looked toward the fresh fill. "And the easement gives them drainage rights through this strip, not ownership of the structure." That was the first piece. Rebecca had the second waiting at her office. By noon, her conference table was covered with the original Fox Hollow subdivision plat, the recorded drainage easement, archived site plans, and a set of as-built drawings for the recreation complex. Daniel Price, a civil engineer who specialized in stormwater and pavement failures, sat across from me with a yellow pencil and a scale ruler. Rebecca started with the easement. "Read the verbs," she said. The document granted Fox Hollow the right to convey stormwater through the designated corridor and maintain necessary flow. It also prohibited obstruction of the drainage path and required responsibility for damage caused by unauthorized alterations. I looked at Susan's certified letter beside it. So she has the right to send water through. Correct. Not the right to bury the outlet. Not according to this language. Daniel had already moved on to the engineering sheet. He traced a red drainage line from the recreation area downhill. It started along Court 2, past a collection structure near the inspection grate I had photographed, followed a swale, then crossed toward my lane. His pencil stopped at the culvert. "There it is." I leaned closer. "That grate drains here. The court perimeter system contributes here. So does nearby surface runoff." He followed the line again. "The original design depends on this outlet staying functional." Suddenly the photograph of water sitting high beneath the inspection grate made sense. So did the way the system had been behaving after rain. Susan had not buried some isolated pipe at the bottom of my property. She had buried the downstream release point for a drainage network serving land uphill, including the area around the tennis courts. Daniel turned to another sheet showing elevations. "The outlet invert is lower than the court drainage structures by design. That gives the water somewhere to go. Restrict the outlet, and the hydraulic grade line rises upstream." "Meaning?" Rebecca asked. Daniel kept it simple. "Meaning water starts staying where the system was built to remove it." He did not say the courts would fail. He did not say the damage had already happened. Good engineers do not jump past what the measurements support. He said the blocked outlet created a condition consistent with elevated upstream water and increased saturation around connected drainage areas. That was enough. Rebecca laid Susan's landscaping work order beside the as-built plan. Decorative stone. Fill soil. Sod. No engineer. No drainage profile. No elevation check. Then she placed Susan's cease and desist letter next to that. This is useful. Because she admitted they did the work? Because they did the work, claimed authority for it, and ordered you not to reverse it after you warned them. I looked at the red line running under Court 2. For the first time, The whole system was visible on one sheet. The tennis court grate, the swale, the culvert, my property, their drainage. One continuous path. I pointed at the outlet symbol. So she did not bury my drainage problem. Daniel looked at the plan, then at me. No, Rebecca finished the sentence. She buried their outlet on your property. The first crack was thinner than a pencil mark. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning after 2 days without rain, which was exactly why I stopped the truck. Court 2 should have been drying normally. The sky was clear, the temperature was in the low 50s, and the pavement around Fox Hollow's recreation complex looked dry everywhere except along one dark seam near the baseline. I stayed outside the fence on the common access side and looked through the chain link. The crack ran maybe 4 feet at first, narrow enough that most people would have stepped over it without seeing anything. What caught my attention was the color around it. The asphalt was darker there. Damp. Not surface wet from weather. Damp from underneath. I took a photograph with the inspection grate visible in the same frame. Then another from farther back, so nobody could claim I was hiding the location. By Friday, the crack was longer. Still small. Still not dramatic. That was how site failures usually began. People imagine pavement suddenly breaking because something spectacular happens. Most of the time, the surface gives you quiet warnings first. A line. A dip. Water that does not leave. A patch that stays dark after everything around it turns gray and dry. The next weekend, I drove past while a doubles match was going on. One player stopped after a serve and bounced the ball twice near the baseline. The second bounce kicked slightly sideways. He looked down, dragged the sole of his shoe across the court, then called someone over. I kept driving. 2 days later, Todd called me. Susan hired a resurfacing company. For court 2. Both courts, I think. Did they look at the drainage? I do not know. That answer changed 3 days later when I saw a white contractor van parked beside the tennis pavilion. I recognized the company name from commercial site work projects. I parked well away from the work area and waited until the crew finished. One of the contractors was standing outside the fence talking to Susan. He pointed toward the baseline crack, then toward the edge of the court. Susan had her arms folded. I could not hear everything from where I stood, but I caught one sentence when the contractor raised his voice slightly. This is moving underneath. Susan shook her head and gestured at the surface as if the problem could still be rolled flat. Later that afternoon, Todd confirmed what I suspected. They said the base feels soft in one section. Did they recommend patching? They said they could patch it, but they would not guarantee it until somebody figured out why the base is holding moisture. I looked toward the lower lane from my workshop. The culvert outlet was still packed with fill, decorative stone, and sod. Susan's letter was still in my file telling me not to touch any of it. What did Susan say? I asked. Todd exhaled. She said the courts are old. They were not that old. The as-built drawings Rebecca found put the recreation complex at less than 15 years, and the surface had been renewed once already. That did not mean age played no role. Asphalt moves. Temperatures change. Subgrades settle. But Daniel had taught me a long time ago that one symptom rarely proves one cause. So I did not tell anyone the culvert caused the crack. I kept measuring. After the next rain, the inspection grate rose nearly to the same high level I had photographed before. The dark seam widened. A shallow puddle remained along the low side of court 2 nearly 24 hours after the rest of the surface dried. I photographed the puddle from the common walkway, recorded the rainfall amount, and checked the red elevation nailed downhill. Water at the head wall was still sitting above the old white mineral line. Susan sent the resurfacing company back with crack filler and a small roller. They sealed the visible line. For a week, court 2 looked better. Then a second crack appeared 3 feet away, running almost parallel to the first. I sent both photographs to Daniel. He called me 10 minutes later. Do not call this failure yet, he said. But do not stop documenting. What are you seeing? A pattern that deserves measurements. 2 mornings later, he met me near the recreation complex with a level, moisture probe, and notebook. He checked elevations from the accessible perimeter, compared the court edge to the original plan, and tested moisture where he could lawfully reach. When he finished, he closed the notebook and looked through the fence at the patched line. The asphalt is only showing us what the soil underneath has been saying for weeks. The third warning was the one Susan signed for herself. The first had been mine, sent the morning after the culvert outlet was buried, explaining that the new fill was restricting discharge and pushing water above the old white mineral line on the head wall. The second came from Daniel Price after he finished his measurements around Court 2. His letter was careful, technical, and impossible to dismiss as neighborhood drama. He documented elevated upstream water conditions, persistent moisture around the recreation area, and a drainage configuration consistent with restricted downstream discharge. He recommended reopening the culvert outlet and inspecting the connected system before additional pavement repairs were attempted. Susan acknowledged receipt by electronic mail. Her answer was 4 sentences long. The courts were aging. Seasonal moisture was normal. The association had maintained the drainage corridor responsibly. No further action was planned. Rebecca read that response at her desk, then looked at me. Now we send the third one. Her letter included Daniel's findings, Mark Ellis's survey, the recorded drainage easement, and the original as-built drawing showing the red drainage line from Court 2 to the culvert on my property. It also quoted Susan's own cease and desist order telling me not to disturb the fill the association had installed. Rebecca ended with a simple demand: restore the outlet, preserve all construction records, and stop interfering with the drainage path. Susan signed for the certified letter 2 days later. 3 warnings, 3 acknowledgments, 3 chances to fix one buried outlet. She chose none of them. December turned wet. Then January turned cold. Rain soaked the ground for 2 days, followed by a hard overnight freeze. When the temperature climbed again, I drove past Fox Hollow on my way to a job and saw that Court 2 had changed. The original crack near the baseline had widened. New lines branched from it in short, crooked angles. One corner of the playing surface looked slightly lower than the surrounding pavement, enough that water collected there in a shallow, dark patch after the rest of the court dried. A week later, the patching material Susan had paid for split along the edge. Then Court 1 developed a narrow crack near the shared side between the courts. Nobody called it catastrophic. Daniel did not use dramatic words. He said differential movement, softened base, persistent moisture, freeze-thaw stress, terms that sounded quiet until you stood beside a tennis court and watched the lines spread. The association closed Court 2 temporarily. That was when Susan changed tactics. I received a letter stating that the board was investigating whether I had failed to maintain the culvert located on my property and whether that failure had contributed to drainage problems affecting association amenities. I read it twice, then laughed once because there was nothing else to do. I drove straight to Rebecca's office. She already had Susan's certified letter on the conference table. "They are blaming you for not maintaining the culvert," she said. "The same culvert they ordered me not to touch." "Exactly." She slid the cease and desist letter toward me. Susan's signature was at the bottom. Rebecca tapped the sentence requiring me not to remove fill, stone, sod, or association-installed improvements. "This is why I told you to wait." She drafted a response that afternoon. It did not argue about motives. It did not accuse anyone of incompetence. It simply attached the timeline. Ryan Keller warns that the outlet is obstructed. Susan declines action. Daniel Price issues engineering warning. Susan acknowledges. Rebecca Sloan demands restoration. Susan signs for delivery. Ryan is instructed in writing not to disturb the work. Then the association attempts to blame Ryan for leaving the work undisturbed. When Megan Walsh, the treasurer, saw the packet, she called me directly. "Did Susan really tell you not to clear the outlet?" "In writing. And we still find you for not maintaining it." That is what the latest letter says. Megan was silent for several seconds. "I need to see the original." Rebecca has it. By the end of that week, the board had copies of all 3 warnings and Susan's cease and desist order. The cracks on Court 2 kept spreading across the baseline, while the argument above them got smaller and smaller. Susan had spent months insisting the problem was mine to maintain, hers to control, and nobody's to question. Now every version of that story had her signature on it. The repair crew did not understand the argument until they cut Court 2 open. By then, Fox Hollow had closed both courts. The January freeze had passed, and a stretch of mild rain had left the recreation complex smelling like wet asphalt and cold clay. I stood outside the work area with Daniel while a pavement contractor used a saw to cut through the cracked surface near the baseline. The blade screamed against the asphalt, water sprayed along the cut, and dark pieces of pavement came up one section at a time. Susan stood beside Megan Walsh near the pavilion, arms folded tightly across her coat. The first slab looked ordinary from the top. Underneath, The base aggregate told a different story. It was dark, wet, and packed with moisture where it should have been firm enough to support the court surface. The contractor pushed a probe into one exposed section and frowned. "This is soft." Daniel crouched beside the opening and checked the elevation against his notes. Then he looked toward the inspection grate near Court 2. Same pattern. They opened a second area closer to the shared side between the courts. More wet aggregate. Softer material. The contractor lifted another broken piece of asphalt and set it with the others. By noon, the neat green surface Susan had spent months protecting was stacked in rough chunks beside the fence. Rubble was not dramatic when you watch professionals create it. It was just the final form of a repair nobody wanted to pay for. A geotechnical consultant arrived that afternoon and reviewed the exposed base, moisture conditions, site elevations, drainage plans, and Daniel's measurements. Nobody claimed the buried culvert was the only possible factor in every crack. Age, temperature cycles, pavement condition, and local settlement all mattered. But the drainage restriction was now impossible to dismiss. The original system had been designed to move water away from the recreation area and discharge it downhill through my culvert. The outlet had been restricted. Upstream water levels had risen. Persistent moisture had developed around the connected drainage path. The court base had softened in the same area where the first cracks appeared. That evening, the board held an emergency meeting. Rebecca sat beside me with 4 documents arranged in front of her. Mark's survey, the recorded easement, the original as-built drainage plan, Susan's signed work order and cease and desist letter. The association attorney started with the survey. The culvert outlet is located on Mr. Keller's property. Then the easement. The association has the right to convey stormwater through the corridor. It does not have unrestricted authority to obstruct or materially alter the owner's drainage structure. Then the as-built drawing. Daniel traced the red line from Court 2 to the collection structure, through the swale, and down to my culvert. Finally, Rebecca placed Susan's letter on the table. Mr. Keller warned the association that the outlet was restricted. The association instructed him not to remove the fill. Megan looked at Susan. "And then we sent him a maintenance violation?" Susan's expression hardened. "Because the culvert is on his land." The attorney answered before Rebecca could. "Ownership does not erase the association's responsibility for work it ordered." Megan turned toward him. "Are we billing Ryan for the court repairs?" "No. Are we keeping the fines?" "I recommend withdrawing them immediately." Susan leaned forward. "The courts were already aging." Daniel nodded. "That can be true, and the drainage problem can still be material. Those are not mutually exclusive." The room went quiet. Nobody needed a villain speech. The pavement pieces outside had already made the argument physical. The board voted to withdraw every drainage-related fine against me, authorize professional restoration of the culvert outlet, and require engineering review before any future alteration to shared drainage infrastructure. Susan was removed from authority over the restoration project pending a broader board review. 2 days later, Todd returned to my lane with an engineer, a survey sheet, and written permission signed by both the association and me. This time, nobody called it beautification. They removed the decorative stone, peeled back the sod, excavated the compacted fill, and exposed the concrete head wall one careful bucket at a time. When the last packed soil came away from the outlet, muddy water rushed forward, then settled into a steady flow downstream. I stood beside the red elevation nail and watched the waterline begin dropping toward the old white mineral stain. Susan had spent months arguing that the buried pipe looked better. By the time the courts were cut into pieces, appearance was the least expensive part of the problem. By spring, the culvert looked almost exactly the way it had before Susan decided concrete needed hiding. The head wall was exposed again. The outlet was protected with properly placed riprap instead of packed landscaping fill. The white mineral stain was still visible on the concrete, only now the water sat below it after normal rain. The red elevation nail remained in the oak. The brass survey cap still marked the edge of my property. Nothing about the repair was decorative, and that was why it worked. Fox Hollow spent the next several weeks rebuilding the tennis courts properly. The contractor removed the failed sections, replaced softened base material, corrected drainage around the recreation complex, and waited for acceptable moisture conditions before placing new asphalt. Daniel reviewed the drainage details before the surface work started. This time, Nobody treated the inspection grate beside Court 2 like a piece of scenery. They traced it, measured it, and confirmed where the water went. The board also adopted a new rule requiring engineering review and property record verification before anyone could alter shared drainage features, culverts, swales, outlets, or easement corridors. Megan sent me the final policy after it passed. I read it once and filed it beside Susan's old cease and desist letter. Same cabinet. Very different lesson. Susan did not stay president long enough to oversee the reopened courts. A special board review had already stripped her of authority over infrastructure projects, and when the next election came around, she lost by a margin wide enough that nobody needed a recount. Todd told me later that she blamed politics. I never argued with that. People can call consequences whatever makes them easier to carry. What mattered to me was that the drainage worked again. The first heavy spring storm arrived on a Saturday night. Rain hammered the metal roof of my workshop and ran in silver sheets across the lane. I pulled on a jacket and walked down with a flashlight, not because I expected trouble, but because 30 years of site work teaches you to check the first real test. Water entered the culvert upstream in a steady brown stream and exited cleanly through the open head wall. No backed-up pool, no seep-through packed clay, no rising line toward the rusted bolt. Just flow. I checked the red elevation nail, then stood there for another minute listening to water move through 36 inches of concrete the way it had been designed to move. The next morning, I drove uphill past Fox Hollow. The rebuilt tennis courts were wet from the storm, but draining. No dark seam lingered along the old baseline area. No puddle sat beside Court 2. The inspection grate was clear. A few residents were already standing near the pavilion waiting for the surface to dry. From the road, the courts looked almost exactly like they had before the first crack. That was the strange part. The most expensive infrastructure lessons usually end with everything looking normal again. I stopped at the lower lane on my way home and looked at the culvert head wall. Susan had wanted it hidden because she thought visible drainage made the property look unfinished. I understood something she never did. Working infrastructure is supposed to disappear into daily life, not under dirt. Nobody notices the culvert when it works. Nobody talks about the grate when it drains. Nobody thinks about the base under a tennis court until the surface starts breaking above it. She thought I was waiting for her tennis courts to fail. I was waiting for her to understand that I never had to break anything. She had already buried the one thing keeping them dry.